the new social encyclical letter on human development and American politics in 2010, discourse number 4. And we want to start again with the reading first, and we continue Luke on the Sermon on the Mount. We have 2 reports on the Sermon on the Mount. One is in Matthew, the other one is in Luke, and we started with that of Luke. Why do we do this? We had first the reading of the Decalogue and then the Sermon on the Mount, because what the Pope does in his encyclical, he tries to make these laws present today, and what it means, what they mean for our civil society with all its antagonisms and so on. So these are the foundations really of all the encyclical letters. The popes from Leo XIII on, which means Rerum Novarum, new things are happening in capitalism, up to this one, Love in Truth, is the attempt to put the old codes into a new context, the old texts into a new context, and apply them and provide people with a new option. And that is why we do this here. We have the possibility of socialism, of liberalism, of pre-Roosevelt liberalism, post-Roosevelt liberalism, and the pre-Roosevelt liberalism has led us into this horrible catastrophe in which we still are, and the post-Roosevelt liberalism is not able to pull us out, or at least not fast enough. And so therefore we ask, are there other options? We have Father Coughlin's fascism option, or Henry Ford's fascist option, or Hitler's fascist option, and then we have of course the socialistic options, and very often the Fox News calls the president a socialist, so they smell the rat somehow. And we want to have that movie today about SICO, about health insurance, because the president just postponed his trip to Australia, because this is most important now. In the next week or so, he will push the whole thing through by the reconciliation mechanism. That means only with his party, because after a whole year of discussion with the other party, there was no movement really. So therefore, this movie will show the whole problematic in which we find. By the way, there will be no public option, which is of course a defeat for the president. There is no single payer thing, which most people in the democratic left really wanted to have. That's what all of Europe has, that's what Canada has, and so on. So maybe the president should have started out with the single payer option, and then with the most what he really wanted, and then could have given in. But he gave in already before he started. He started with a public option, and then he lost even that. But he wants to rescue some of it. So that is the context in which we read those texts here. So it is here Luke, and we have Luke 6:36 to 49, a little bit shorter. And the titles here, Compassion and Generosity, they are not in the original text. They have been done by the translators, but that is what it's all about. So I just read this so that we have our foundation. Be compassionate as your Father is compassionate, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. So it could have been the Mount is at the Sea of Galilee near Tiberias. And there is a little chapel today which remembers the Sermon on the Mount. But Luke has no mount. There's no mountain. Only Matthew has a mountain. So we know that the texts, of course, are written in different communities, and sometimes they leave something out and so on. But this is one of those many, many, many differentiations. Hello, sister. How are you?
Good. We are on our way out now. Will you make sure you lock the door and shut off the lights?
We will, yeah.
When we leave, because it was all open last week.
Oh,
when I came
David
over
was
10
supposed to.
It was all open and the lights were still on. So.
Yeah. So David was supposed to do it. He will be here in a minute.
Okay, so will you tell him to do that?
I will tell him
because I won't get home till midnight. I really don't want to come over here then and help it.
Where are these students going?
Pretty late vacation. It's the retreat weekend.
Pretty late. I remember now.
And they have the retreat here, or?
Well, they start here, and then they go out there, and then they come back here Sunday and finish.
Oh, I see. Oh, good.
So have a good class.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
It should be quiet now for you.
Okay, that's fine. So there are variations in the text and so on, so we don't have to go into this. Do not judge, and you will not be judged yourself. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned yourselves. Grant pardon, and you will be pardoned. So this thing you should not judge. Of course, everywhere in the New Testament there is judgment, of course. So what it really means is one should not condemn anybody. In the other text there in Matthew, it just says don't judge anybody, but it means the same thing, and here condemnation is there. So, of course, one has to differentiate between good and evil and so on, but if people don't do the right thing, then one should not condemn them. Give, and there will be gifts for you, a full measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. Because the amount you measure out is the amount you will be given. So in the other text, it means, if you judge somebody, then you will be judged the same way. So integrity here, he also told a parable to them. Can one blind man guide another? Surely both will fall into a pit. The disciple is not superior to his teacher. The fully trained disciple will always be like his teacher. Why do you? So this is the halakha and the storytelling. And Jesus is a great storyteller, and so here's one of these stories. Why do you observe the splinter in your brother's eye and never notice the plank in your own? So if we criticize other people, we should take our plank there out of our eye first so that we can see clearly. We put this up in another way. We said somehow that our own constitution as Americans and the constitution of the Pope and his letter, so that we are aware of both of them. I have a class there on the liberation theology, and the liberation theologians have, of course, a bias for the poor. The New Testament has a bias for the poor. But we as Americans, as far as our social character is concerned, not our individual character, that can be very different, but our social character, we do not have a bias for the poor. We do have a bias for the rich. So 2 days ago, we measured the success of our economy by how many billionaires it produces. Even the world economy is judged by how many billionaires. And the first time we have less billionaires than other people. I think Mexico has the richest of all of them. Now, this is obviously a bias in terms of the rich, because what an economy should do, it should be bound to the need system. That means the need for food, the need for clothing, the need for housing, the need for teaching, the need for health insurance, and so on. That is the measurement, not how many billionaires somebody had. And of course, these billionaires have stolen the stuff from other people because they cannot possibly have worked for $1 billion. That means so many labor hours that they cannot possibly personally do that. So they use the labor hours of other people, and they produce the surplus value, which those who have worked for it don't get, and those who have not worked for it get it, and so on. So, that is our bias. So, if we have this bias, and we look at the encyclical, where sometimes there is a bias also for the poor, for the fourth estate, that means the working class, about 180 to 200 million people in this country, the majority and so on. And if we come with the normal bias of Americans, there may be a clash. That means we may have something in our eye which makes it not possible for us to see things clearly. So this is a wonderful epistemological advice there, that one should remove, first of all, one's own bias so that one can see who the other really is. Okay, brother, let me take out the splinter that is in your eye when you cannot see the plank in your own eye. Hypocrite, take the plank. There is not a sweet Jesus stuff there. This New Testament doesn't tell us anything about the sweet Jesus, so they made him up later on.
Yeah.
So the hypocrite, take the plank out of your own eye first, and then you will see clearly enough to take out the splinter that is in your brother's eye. So my constitution and the constitution of the other must be seen. Even physicists know today, when we look at atoms or whatever, Heisenberg emphasized that it changes the object which we look at. So therefore, this is called theory of knowledge, that we are open in ourselves, or that we hold some things back maybe, so that we can see the other, in this case the encyclical letter, the teaching of the church better. There is no, I mean, the reason why we are a small group, and we, you know, there are a lot of people in this parish and so on, may have something to do that the constitution of the people and that what the papacy teaches or what the church teaches do not really fit. People would then say the church should become modern, the church should adjust to things, and so on, church should be liberal, and all these things. So so these are the subject and the object, and both sides are in motion. That is important. So what we look at is in motion because the teaching of the church evolves, and also we evolve as we make our experiences day after day. There is no sound tree that produces rotten fruit. By the way, we see that the New Testament, of course, like the Torah and like the Quran, it smells a little bit like village air. That's what Adorno said all the time. It smells like village, like countryside. So this about the trees here. There is no sound tree that produces rotten fruit, nor again a rotten tree that produces sound fruit. For every tree can be told by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorns, nor gather grapes from brambles. A good man draws what is good from the store of goodness in his heart. A bad man draws what is bad from the store of badness. For a man's words flow out of what fills his heart. So then in another text comes this thing, by their fruits you will know them. And of course, as far as the last 8 years are concerned, that millions of Catholics and evangelicals voted for this mass murderer twice shows that they did not ask the question of how one knows if somebody is a good man or a bad man or a bad tree or whatever. By their fruits you will know them. They just have to look what the fruits were. 150 people executed in Texas, and then 1 million people dead in Iraq, and we are not even remembering that. We are not feeling sorry about it. We don't try to find atonement, nothing at all. This is really worrisome, particularly when it happens in the church. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? Jesus says here, everyone who comes to me and listens to my words and acts on them, I will show you what he is like. He is like the man who, when he built his house, dug deep and laid the foundations on rock. When the river was in flood, it bore down and that house, but could not shake it. It was so well built. But the one who listens and does nothing is like the man who built his house on soil with no foundation. As soon as the river, the tsunami, bore down on it, it collapsed, and what a ruin that house became. So these are all nice little countryside stories which Jesus, it was first of all, it came from Galilee and only then went to Jerusalem and went to the Greek cities and so on. So originally Christianity and all the other Abrahamic religions were village things, village stories. Okay, so that as far as our beginning is concerned, and I would like to do something which I maybe forgot the last time. I want to say something about that very shortly, namely a timeline. We had that the last time, but we didn't get into it, I think. When we see this, Christianity, and we say it's 2,000 years old, it may be very old, and for many people they may say because it is so old, therefore, it has nothing to tell us. So I just want to give very short, just a few dates in terms of the timeline. We can say that our universe, when you look tonight, if the clouds are not there, and you see the Milky Ways and the star constellations, all that together, what you can see there, is about 3 trillion years old. 3 trillion years old. So since the Big Bang. So the Big Bang has now been accepted by, it was from the priest Mercier in Belgium. He discovered it, and in the meantime all physicists and so on have accepted it. So that would be the starting point. This is unimaginable type of time span. About 7 million years ago, we separated from the chimpanzees, 7 million years ago. A few years ago, Lucy was discovered in Africa, and they estimated she was about 1 million years old. So she was already far ahead in the evolutionary process. Then we have maybe 10,000 years ago, we begin with to change from hunters and fishermen and so on slowly into agriculture. So where people suddenly settle and work starts, people start working. And one reason for this anti-Semitism through the centuries is that that the Jewish people were not able or were not willing to settle down and to become farmers, but that they remained nomads. So we have the Jewish people, where the Torah comes from, and then also the New Testament. They come from Abraham, and Abraham started in Ur, and Ur is not too far away from Baghdad, close to 2,000 years. The civilization where he came from was about 3,800 years, is about 3,800 years old. That means the Euphrates and Tigris civilization. On the other side, there is the Nile civilization, which is about 3,200 years old. And then we have in the east the Indus civilization in India, which is about 2,000 or so years old. And then 1,500 years would be the Hong Kong culture, the Yellow River culture. But these two Eastern cultures, they stay in the background. So for the development of Judaism and for the Torah and so on, what is important is the Euphrates and Tigris and the Nile culture. So here by 3,000 or so, the wheel was invented for wagons. Also the potter's wheel. Also the computer, the beginning of the computer. In the temples, things were computed with certain machines, which then were evolved further. And here we have the first writings. So we have to think that for thousands and thousands of years, people had no real language. People had no names. Their tribes had no names whatsoever. They had no religion, no morality, and so on. Most of the things which we have now have developed in the last 10,000 years or so in these four high cultures. In the Nile culture, we have a new language, and Hebrew is a mixture of both of them. Moses, for instance, is an Egyptian name, and Freud therefore asked the question if Moses was not really Hebrew, was not really an Egyptian all the way, and was not part of the Hebrew tribes. So from then on, we have then writing and wheels, and then of course the combination of these parts, that is how then evolution starts. We have, after the villages developed from 3,000 on, we have the first city-states. Jericho is the oldest state, oldest city-state is about 3,200 or so years old. Here we have a little lapse again. The Torah says that Joshua conquered Canaan, and he came to Jericho, and then the trumpets blew and the wall fell down. The wall of Jericho had fallen down 1,000 years earlier already. So we see sometimes these holy writings are historically or geographically and so on not correct. So this is higher criticism, and none of these religions can survive without going through this higher criticism. It does not disturb the faith position, but it may have something to do with beliefs which may have to be changed. They are all written in the Ptolemaic world paradigm. Ptolemaeus, an Egyptian, thought that the world was flat and there was a sky with holes on top of it. And then, of course, Galileo, Copernicus first, and then Galileo changed that, and we still have some people are still sitting at the Lake Michigan and see, look, honey, how beautiful the sun sets, and so on. We should really say, look, honey, how beautiful the world rolls backward behind us, and slowly the sun will disappear, but not the sun moves, but we sitting here move, and so on. So it was very hard. And there's some people, we have some professors even who have a hard time still to, because what appears is not what is really the case. And sciences continually show us that what appears is not the right thing. And the anti-intellectualism which we have in the church and so on has something to do that these damned intellectuals always say things are different than the way people see it all the time. Okay, so then in the city-states develops that what the popes are really addressing now, and that is utmost importance. And I think it has not penetrated of us enough. Namely, from let's see, 3,000 cities start, and then in the cities suddenly develops that what we call civil society between the family and the state. That means the family is the most primitive, the most archaic of all social organisms, and to a large extent still biological, still very natural, much more natural than the state or civil society and so on. So, the civil society takes out of the family the productive side. So the shoemakers made shoes at home, the bakers baked bread at home. Now suddenly we have bread factories, or we have shoe factories and so on. At the same time, civil society, which deprives the family of its productivity, does not take over the care which the family has to give to its members. But the family cannot give that care anymore because it has lost its productivity. And so, therefore, civil society or the state now have to take all that over which falls under care, education, and health, and so on and so on. And the civil society here in this country doesn't do it. And the state, up to today, with Obama now putting that pressure, the state did not do it sufficiently either. So we have, when you read Antigone, for instance, Antigone has two brothers. One brother fights against the city, and the other brother fights for it. The king wants to, from the state point of view, the one who fought for the city should be buried. The other one who fought against the city should be left to the birds. But Antigone represents the gods of the netherworld, the matriarchal gods, and these gods tell her that she has to bury both of her brothers, because both are her blood, and so on. And so the king then sentences to death Antigone and with her lover, and she is walled into and has to die there, is walled in alive, is buried alive, practically. And so Antigone is the one who says this about the theodicy problem. From what we suffer, we know how much we have sinned. Antigone has not sinned against the gods of the netherworld, the mother gods, but against the god of the state. The god of the state is in heaven. The god of the mothers is down in the depth. So, but there is nothing in between. There is no civil society yet. So the civil society slowly develops, and as it develops a certain type. And this type is called then the bourgeois. We are a bourgeois society. The bourgeois is the guy who is concerned with his own private good. He does not care about the common good. The common good is what the king is caring for, or the citizen. So on one side in French we have the citoyen, who cares for the common good, and we have the bourgeois, who is just concerned with his own profit, and so on. And so this bourgeois now develops. And the first one is Odysseus. Odysseus is the first prototype who rises out of the mythical world, and then you can see how Odysseus treats things. There you have Henry Ford already, you have Bush already, you have all the arch bourgeois crawling around here. You have them all there in their original structure. Just very shortly, Odysseus men slaughter the gods of Poseidon, the cows of Poseidon, and therefore Poseidon then punishes the men of Odysseus by killing them. He leaves Odysseus alive but lets him suffer. So Odysseus is called the much suffering one. The bourgeois is a type who can give hurts, who can make people suffer, particularly the weaker ones, but he is also willing to take suffering upon himself. So after Troy has fallen, And it has not fallen because of the brevity and the fortitude of the great soldiers under Agamemnon, but because of the tricky Dick, because of Odysseus, because after 10 years of beleaguering the city of Troy, Odysseus then behaves like a real bourgeois. The bourgeois looks at the needs. That's what they do on television every night. They look at the need of the masses, and then they hook them by their need. And Odysseus has observed for 10 years the character of the Trojans. The Trojans are very curious people, and these curious people cannot help it. They have to follow their curiosity. So he makes that horse, the Trojan horse, and puts it in the moonshine. And he knows, and he speculates, like every capitalistic businessman, that they will fall for it. That's what we call market research. And so when the moon shines, they look at the horse, and the Trojans cannot help it. They pull the horse into the city, and in the horse there is a group of Greeks, and when everybody is asleep peacefully, they go and open the walls the doors from inside, and the whole Greek army now storms the city and butchers everybody to the last man, woman, and child. So Odysseus did this, not by fighting, but by calculating, by speculating. That's where all that comes from, speculating, and so on, what you do on Wall Street, and finding the needs. And if you don't find the right needs, you have to produce them. You have to give them useless needs just in order to be able to hook them. And you'll see that this is what the capitalists do every minute on every television station. So then the Odysseus is then driven across the Mediterranean because Poseidon is angry about him because he has slaughtered his cows. So the attitude of the bourgeois to religion, he does not take it seriously. He wants to maybe manipulate the gods, if he believes in them at all. He has a very ambiguous relationship to religion. So when the bourgeois came into power, first they guillotined the priests and so on, but then they found out it is much better to use them and to instrumentalize them. And so they instrumentalize them up to this moment. So therefore we cannot expect in a bourgeois society or bourgeois religion, and that's all we have in Kalamazoo, that this is something genuine or whatever. It is some attempt to, if they believe in God, as all Nietzsche says, they have killed God. Civil society has murdered God, and they have not even noticed it. It will take some time for lightning to strike and so on. So they will not, it will take a long time for them to see what they really have done. They have killed God. But insofar as they have not killed him completely, they try to manipulate him and say, God bless America or whatever. So that means we do the thing and then we want to have the blessing. I went to the swimming pool recently, and an old policeman from here, he said, how can they say God bless America all the time when we are doing these things? We have just killed 1 million people. How can God bless us? And so on. Well, the bourgeois doesn't think that way. So, Walter, did you have something?
No, just an observation about God bless America. This became very prominent after 9/11, but God apparently ignored America.
Yeah, of course it does. Yeah. So did Odysseus too. And so Odysseus then, well, first his men are still with him. So he goes to an island, and there is a primitive guy. He is not really differentiated. Evolution means differentiation. And this giant has only one eye. That's a sign how undifferentiated he is. So he goes into his cave, he eats up his food, and there he comes home and sees those Greeks there in his cave. He puts a big rock in front of it and catches them all and begins to eat one after the other every morning for breakfast. Now here is this tricky dick there, the bourgeois sitting in that cave. What is he doing now? And he speculates, you know, is there any need of this guy by which we can hook him? No, there isn't, because he's a damn primitive. So, but then in the corner there are some grapes, and then Odysseus stamps these grapes and makes wine of it. The giant has never drunk any wine, so now they produce an artificial need in him for wine, and he drinks, of course, gets drunk. Then he falls down and lays there, is drunk and snores. Now Odysseus takes a stick, puts it in the fire, and then puts it sadistically into the one eye which he has, and turns it around and so on. That is the sadism of the bourgeois, against the minority, against the blacks, against the Jews, and so on. And he has a masochistic side too. If something does it to him, then he is suffering that as well. But this is the sadistic side. So the guy has horrible pain, he stands up and shouts and screams, and then in the morning cannot see those guys anymore. So he opens up the hole there and takes his sheep out. And against the cunning. Cunning is what the bourgeois does all the time. He is not a brave fellow. He is not strong or fortitude. He never fights. He lets other people fight. The feudal lord fought, and his farmers carried his weapons. The bourgeois stays in the background, makes profit from the ammunition and the uniforms and so on, and lets his workers fight out there. It's just turned upside down between feudalism and the bourgeoisie. And so then he binds his man under the sheep, and so the blind man can only touch from above, and underneath all the guys walk out with the sheep. And Odysseus himself puts himself under the biggest of all the sheep, and then is carried out too. So when they are out now, it's not the end yet. Odysseus with his sadism goes on. That means he shouts into the mountains, and of course the ego comes from the wrong direction. So now the giant throws stones and he wants to hit the ships, but he follows the ego and throws the stones in the wrong direction, and Odysseus leaves with his man and has a tremendous enjoyment about the whole thing. So there we see the attitude of the bourgeois toward nature, the attitude toward primitive people whom he colonizes, and then he comes to an island where the Circe is, a woman left over of the matriarchal time, and she has turned all the men who came to her island into pigs. And now again Odysseus uses cunning. He knows what the buttons to push in order to make her fall in love with him. He forces her that way to change those pigs into people again. He even makes her that she gives him a boat so that he can go home to this. For 10 years he was not at home with his wife, and so he then sails off. He goes through Gibraltar, the Scylla and Charybdis, and Charybdis is a rock where the sirens are sitting and singing, and that has meant, the crashing of the boats for years and years, and Odysseus knows about that, so he lets his man to put him on the mast of the ship, bind him, but he leaves his ears open, and the men are ruddering down there, and they have wax in their ears, so they cannot hear anything. So as they approach and the sirens sing, he, the bourgeois, can enjoy this wonderful song, this Beethoven, this Mozart, these wonderful things, but he cannot give orders to move closer and closer, because nobody hears him, because their ears are stuffed with wax and so on. So they are ruddering, and he enjoys that and so on. That's what you have in Detroit. The third estate enjoys all this culture. The guys in the factories are doing the ruddering, and of course the down there with the wax in their ear, they cannot hear music, they cannot see paintings, they can do nothing, instead ruddering down in the machine room down there. So nevertheless, he doesn't fall for the sirens, but he enjoys them, and then he comes home. And when he comes home, the people who wanted to marry his wife now, there's Penelope, and she weaves. She told the people who wanted to marry her that she had to finish up first a certain vestment or certain clothing or whatever, and every night she opens it up again and starts again weaving again in order to push, these sewers, the people who want to marry her out. And so Odysseus sees the whole thing. He meets an old servant who tells him the whole story. He sees his son and he allies with them, and then again with a trick and cunning he kills in the most murderous way one of the sewers after the other, one of these people who wanted to marry, and of course ate his cows and so on. So he takes horribly revenge. Lex talionis, the law of the thought, that is what the bourgeois practices, and in the end they are all dead. But he's happy he's with his wife again, and so on. So Odysseus is the prototype of the bourgeois, who is the member of civil society, and civil society is the target of all encyclical letters. And these encyclical letters are in the tradition of Plato, or Aristotle, so the Aristotelian. The present Pope is a specialist for the Greek and the Roman Church Fathers, and they already made this attack continually following Plato and so on. What did Plato do? When Plato saw that civil society and the bourgeois were destroying A, the family, think of our high divorce rate, B, the state, think of our high corruption rate every day, and the environment on top of it. They destroy, civil society destroys all of them. That means all the city-states, and later on the Roman city-states, Babylonian city-states, Sodom and Gomorrah, they had a king and a priest, everything the civil society destroys like a cancer. And so from Plato on, philosophers are something like psychoanalysts for civilizations. They want to rescue their civilization. And so Plato wrote the book on the state, and then another book on laws, in order to repress civil society, in order to rescue the state. And this Platonic trait goes up into Lenin and so on, the attempt of socialism and communism. When we say they are not for freedom and so on, then we mean they are repressing the bourgeois, they are repressing civil society. And why do they do that? In order to rescue the state, the family, the civilization, and so on. And we know 1983, of course, there was a neoliberal counter-revolution which was very successful, and since that time the civil society was to be re-established again. But a few weeks ago in the Ukraine, people voted for the socialists again. So the Westerner was voted out, and the candidate from eastern Ukraine, where all the heavy industry is, and they want to return to the Russian Federation, they won. So I went to 10 times or 8 times or 9 times, I think, to Yalta, and with the theme of religion and civil society. That means on the presupposition that civil society would return again. And the idea was a catching up revolution. That means civil society had not sufficiently developed when Lenin made his revolution. And you have to go, and that is now a Hegelian thing. That means another great philosopher of modernity who would not, like Plato, say we have to repress civil society, but we have to go through this. You cannot skip liberalism. You have to go through the bourgeois period, otherwise you cannot have a real state. And so I thought that they needed, a new development because they had not gone sufficiently through civil society, and so we promoted this when we supported those people who wanted to have a civil society in the Ukraine. Because, one cannot jump over one's adulthood, as I did. I was a soldier when I was becoming slowly, when I was an adolescent, I was a soldier, so I skipped a stage in my development. And so one has to go through every stage: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, senescence, and so on. And so also with people. And so Marx never thought that Russia would go through socialism. It was Germany, England, France, and so on. That means the most advanced civil societies would change over, where we are now, because that's what's happening to us now. So we went most intensely through civil society. We have to go now into a new stage. But the others, also have, and in England, of course, went through it, and they are much further than we are now in leaving civil society behind. So, nevertheless, that we know what these encyclicals are for. They are the liberals and fascists and communists and socialists and so on. They all are containing provisions or counsels what to do with civil society. Because this is what we have to do. George Soros just said 2 days ago that Obama made a tremendous mistake, and Soros paid Obama's campaign, and because we did not nationalize the banks. So we did nationalize the banks, but we allow the banks now to pay things back, and then the government then loses again control over the banks, and they will give themselves again tremendous bonuses up to Wall Street, even up to $30 billion. And so we will glide into the next depression. That means if we don't get it fast enough, we will have to go into rhythms. That means it will deeper and deeper into the mess in order to go into a new paradigm.
Yeah, but see, you raise a question there. Lenin, you know, talked to the Russian Marxist Plekhanov, and they talked about this here stages of society, which Lenin was familiar with, but Plekhanov emphasized that to him. But what was Lenin to do? Was he to support Kerensky and let the anti-war movement go into a bourgeois government, or shouldn't he have took power?
But this is how it really happened, right? I mean,
yeah, but what did Lenin do wrong then? Did he do anything wrong?
Well, I mean, can you say wrong? I mean, in terms of Marx, of course, himself thought it would come sooner, this moving into a new paradigm, into socialism and communism and so on, because there was nobody has communism yet.
But
we only
Russia
have
was
socialism.
the most backward of European countries.
Yes, and therefore it could never work. Yeah, that's right.
But then, but what was they? But Lenin had a dilemma. What was he to do then?
Well, I mean,
he should have let the bourgeois government take over, and him being its opposition, legal opposition.
Well, I mean, it is not what Lenin, you know, would do or not do or whatever. The question is where Russia was. It had a bourgeoisie, you know. I mean, they had factories, weapon factories, and so on. They were only, and they had a Duma too in the meantime, you know. But the Tsar was still much more authoritarian than the King of Prussia or the King of France or whatever. So
but he was gone already.
Yes, he was gone. But I mean, before Lenin
yes,
came.
I understand that.
So that means Lenin was simply premature. But he had to do what he had to do. So when Marx, in 1848, you know, Marx thought, when he came to Frankfurt, he thought now was the time, you know, when this change would come. But what really happened was the German bourgeoisie allied itself with the nobility against the proletariat. He thought the bourgeoisie would ally itself with the proletariat and would overthrow the thing, and it didn't work.
Well, then he's seen that he had to act, otherwise we could have a reactionary situation.
Right. I mean, so, you know, people do make mistakes. It was premature in terms of the Marxist theory. One has to go through these stages, and Russia did not go through the stage of civil society. That's why Habermas then wrote this little book. That means, you know, the catching up revolution. So that means 1989 was a victory of neoliberalism, but for the Russians it could have been a moment now to recover what they hadn't done. But then what happened from the West is the big corporations moved into the Russian territory, stole everything everywhere, and left again. And the states were not able to control it. That is what George Soros makes clear in his book, why this all failed. So that means the catching up revolution failed too. So there must be some kind of, because if you jump over liberalism, then the working class must then do what the bourgeoisie should have done, the development of the productive forces and so on. And then, so what did Stalin do then? He industrialized. He industrialized, you know, on this side of the Ural, and then built innumerable cities, which up to 1989 didn't even have a name. They only had numbers, you know, with the Gulago help, with cheap labor, so that should not be done by the socialists. In Sweden, you know, Sweden delivered to Germany in 2 wars the iron ore, became tremendously rich, and after this completely developed bourgeoisie, then went over to socialism.
Well, that happened also in Japan. They acquired capital during the Korean War for their development, you know.
Yeah.
And also the Germans robbed France of an immense amount of gold that they brought back from the Prussian, with the Franco-Prussian War,
Right,
Franco-German War,
Yeah.
and that they used for internal development.
Right. But you see, when you see that in Paris, the Germans march into Paris, and then the commune, you know, rises. The commune is the fourth estate. But what the bourgeoisie in Paris did, they allied themselves with the Prussian enemy against their own fourth estate and beat it down. So we have, you know, the commune upheaval in 1831, and Hegel, the whole bourgeoisie, was terribly frightened of this. That was beaten down. 1870 it was beaten down again. Then it came up in Hamburg and Munich and Petrograd and Moscow and so on. To see how long it took the bourgeoisie to guillotine the first and second estate, because, you know, the bourgeoisie came up by the year 1000 after the so-called Dark Ages, the 500 years since the Roman Empire had collapsed. By 1200, the bourgeoisie, you know, the little burghers and the shoemakers and all that, and made walls around their cities, the old Roman cities, in order to defend themselves against the feudal lords. They had a tremendous upheaval in the 16th century in northern Italy and in Belgium and so on. They were beaten down, and then in the 18th century, then they marched to Paris, and they guillotined the king and so on. So it takes, the fourth estate will take as long, or longer, or whatever, as the bourgeoisie took, because the change has to take place on the psychological level, on the social organization level, on the cultural level. You need a reformation before you can have a revolution and so on. So we have to see in this timeline, I wanted to bring up the timeline, you know, where we are and where these encyclical letters come in. So they come in 50 years after Marx announced, you know, the new paradigm. But the new paradigm isn't here even today. So the church, you know, got it too late, the whole thing. They're slow learners. And then they come up, you know, with solidarism, which still allows the ownership of the means of production, which is the real core of the whole problem. Because the capitalistic masters use those instruments in order to transform nature, but the same instruments they also use in order to keep 180 million, 200 million people under their control. Because it is on the basis of their ownership of the machinery that they can hire and fire these people. And the moment they are firing them, they are firing them because they have overproduced. And they have overproduced because they are not planning. So that means when you have already too many cars standing in Detroit, they go on investing into cars. And suddenly they have all these cars and people have 3 cars at home already. So then they advertise and whatever, but it doesn't help anymore. They can't get rid of the inventory. The inventory is against the ceiling. And now they have to wait until the inventory comes down, and usually that took 9 to 12 years and so on. The first time that happened was in 1827. So we will say something about, you know, how Ford here and so on, because as we are in this disaster, we should ask, you know, if those people like Ford and Coughlin and Hitler, they answered those questions already, you know. They were very far ahead in many ways, and they lost the war, and that is true, and therefore they were pushed even further. But Ford had ideas about the whole thing, and I want to, maybe I can do this right away there that we don't lose it. Let me see if I have it here. And you know, I have these 3 volumes coming out, but let me just read a few sentences out of this so that we see what people, the alternatives, you know, or the papal teachings are alternative to other things, how one can deal with this present disaster now. So here it is, the hangman of liberal society. The fascist leaders did not see more in front of themselves than the gathering that jubilated around them and encouraged them, and the frightened negotiation partners like England and so on. So the fascists, like Father Coughlin here, they were low bourgeois people, petit bourgeois people, not high bourgeoisie like Krupp and Thyssen and so on, but low bourgeoisie. So now let's look at this Hitler guy, for instance. That bloc, because of their low bourgeois view of the world, Hitler had not traveled outside of Germany, like most Americans have not traveled outside of the United States. So it's a very narrow thing. I had this thing in the last days, that's my address book was robbed by somebody. Somebody sent letters around, you know, in my name, imitated me. It is a Muslim in Nigeria who over Malta and Europe got into my account, and I will send the FBI tomorrow and the Interpol against him. We have his name and everything. So this so this is the situation in which we, just personally, situation in which we find ourselves. I don't want to go into it, but we can. So, but nevertheless, this petit peu, so what I wanted to say was that my Walter, my assistant who helped me with this whole thing, he thought, that Interpol had no jurisdiction in Africa or whatever, because he has never left well, as a boy he left the country, but not grown up anymore. So he thought, this FBI or CIA or whatever, they had only jurisdiction here or in Canada or whatever. But this is global, of course. This police is global. Every little town or village in Africa, they know exactly where it is and who is there and so on. We could pinpoint even the town, the capital of Nigeria. There is a little town at the sea, and this is where this guy operates. So, and the police will go into every little town of village and so on. So, but the low bourgeoisie in Germany didn't have any experience of what was. So they only saw that the people were so enthusiastic, and they thought, well, we'll make it. And of course, they were wrong about it. Because Hitler saw and foresaw all the weaknesses of liberalism, which we can see now every day, the whole disaster. But they did not see the unbelievable power in liberalism, which it still has. Why? Because it appeals to the lowest in people, to their greed and so on. And that is in us, that is the biggest one, to make money, to become a billionaire, to start out with 10 cents and then have 10 billions and so on and so on. It's the lowest in us, and that is the only thing which can explain it, why after capitalism produced the First World War and the whole disaster with 10 million people dead, I mean, that should have opened up the eyes of everybody. And if they still couldn't see anything and were blind, then the repetition of it with 60 million people dead in 1945, that would have the point to finish it up, and they still couldn't do it. And so now we are in this disaster, I mean, Obama says it all the time, the American people do not even know where we were when suddenly Bush was told the whole system is collapsing, and he began to nationalize the banks and the industries and so on. He was a free market guy through his whole life, and his parents were free market, and his grandparents who operated with Hitler, they were also free market people. And suddenly this man says, overnight, if he had been a genius, he would have gone on with the stupidity. Geniuses do this, but he was limited, and therefore he could just turn around. He said, it's all collapsing. I have to do something. And then Obama is continuing this now, but it doesn't work adequately. No, we push the buttons and invest tremendous amount of things, and the unemployment doesn't go down fast enough. Okay, let me just look at this here. Hitler, the hangman of the liberal society, was in a certain sense too liberal in order to recognize how under the covering of liberalism formed itself outside of Germany the unresistible power and rule of the national industrial potential. So what we have on one side, he sees, Hitler saw the weaknesses of liberalism, but he did not see the strengths, the brutality, which is rooted in the animality of we.
But he also seen the weaknesses in the thinking of the revolutionary movement in Marxism.
Right. So, but let me just see the other one, as far as the liberalism is concerned. Okay, so he did not see the power which was accumulating there. But Hitler saw, like no other, through the untruth in liberalism, the falseness, the lie in liberalism. In the 1930s, Hitler was widely viewed as a protectionist central planner who recognized the failure of the free market and the need for nationally guided economic development. The proto-Keynesian socialist economist John Robinson wrote that Hitler found a cure against unemployment in civil society before Keynes was finished explaining it. That means Hitler gave 7 million people work by kicking liberalism in its ass. And this is exactly in which he agreed with Henry Ford here, namely not to support speculative capital on Wall Street, but productive capital, the people who produce something. The proto-Keynesian social, out of this identification of the untruth in liberalism, Hitler developed his economic policies. He suspended the gold standard, He embarked on huge public works, programs like the Autobahn. He protected the industry from foreign competition. He expanded credit. He initiated job programs. He bullied the private sector on prices and price controls and production decisions. He later on vastly expanded the military. He enforced capital controls. He instituted family planning. He penalized smoking. He brought about national health care and unemployment insurance in the tradition of Chancellor Bismarck. He imposed education standards. He eventually ran huge deficits. That sound familiar? The National Socialist Interventionist program was essential to the regime's rejection of the market economy. Keynes himself, to whom we go back now again after Friedman, Keynes himself praised Hitler's economic program in the foreword to the German edition to the General Theory. Hitler's economists rejected laissez-faire and admired Keynes, even foreshadowing him in many ways. The Keynesians admired Hitler. At the end of his life, Hitler was even aware of and regretted his own residual liberalism as a weakness which he had not been able to overcome. Of course, Hitler's economic policies cannot be separated from his political policies of virulent anti-Semitism, racism, and genocide, which he did not regret at all. Okay, now, unfortunately, what our propaganda has told us about Hitler here is as stupid as what they tell us about everything else. If we could know who the bastard was, then we could know what he did, what he tried, what worked, what did not work, and so on. The only ones who understand some of this is, strangely enough, the Fox News. Because Fox News sometimes call the president a socialist, and then they call him a fascist again. And if they would be a little bit smarter, they could connect the both by Keynes. But it doesn't get that far. So therefore it hangs all in the middle and doesn't get anywhere. The right is so stupid as the left, and the left as the right, and so on. So, and this is what, in little groups like what we have here, this is what should be worked over. And people, instead of playing golf or whatever, should sit on their ass and for once see where they are. But this is not done, as you know. And that will only increase the disaster, the next one into which we will glide. Okay, so my point was, to see the timeline, and we came to this, to civil society, and people like George Soros, who are most successful in civil society. He works in currency speculation and became billionaire many times. And he says, the market, there must be government intervention. The government must intervene. The banks must be nationalized. The big industry must be nationalized. And he says it to Obama too, but Obama, and this is what I was afraid 3, 4, 5 years ago, that he would be too mild, too friendly, too democratic, and so on, and would not hang the bastards. He should have done what they did in London, in Paris, in Berlin, to put them all into prison, but this is not American. When I hear this, it makes me sick. This is not American. Somebody says, we should have nationalized them, or federalized them, so for good, and they say this is not American. I mean, then we have to change what is American. It is possible that something was American once and was right, and now it's American and it's wrong, because the truth has a time core. So what they call American, there was probably a time when this liberalism worked for America, and now the time has come where it leads into disaster. And too many Americans are, when you see, who is for health insurance, you can see what the percentages are, still hang on to that, what they were conditioned in, and cannot know any alternatives. And so the great value of that, what the Pope has written, is that he offers an alternative. If this alternative is acceptable, if it's good, or will it work, or whatever, that is a completely different thing. But if we had just an alternative to liberalism, to the two forms of liberalism, we would be so much better off already. Okay, so as far as the timeline is concerned, in wherever civil society is not overcome, it will destroy the family and the state, and we see it daily. How you just have to look at the divorce rate, and you have to look at the corruption rate, and you see it all. And with us, it's a very special case. While in our timeline, the state came first and civil society came afterwards, with us, civil society was first, and the state developed only very slowly. And you can see that in every cowboy movie, how the cowboys are roaming around, and then there comes a sheriff, and they kick him into his ass, and he falls from the horse, and then he is heroic, and then the judge is 50 miles away, and so slowly Lansing develops, and slowly, this state develops, and then comes the federal government on top of it, and where do they put it? Into the swamps of the Potomac River, which shows the whole contempt which they had for this. And the Tea Party goes on, too much government, and so on and so on. They have not enough government. Everybody else may have too much government, but we suffer from not having enough, because the government is a tiny little guy who sits on the elephant of civil society. Civil society has developed and evolved, and the state sitting on top, which is supposed to control it, is not powerful and strong enough. The inner sovereignty of the American state organization is too weak. The external sovereignty, we have 120 countries in which we have stationed our troops. So the external sovereignty may be adequate or over-adequate, but the inner sovereignty is too weak. And that has to be changed fast enough, because if we allow them again to get privatized, the gangsters, I mean, not the little gangster who sits in Nigeria, and who wants to have $3,800 from me. I mean, he is a little operator. There are the super gangsters, in Wall Street, who give themselves $30 billion bonuses, So, but what I told my friends, is who do not want to go to Interpol and so on, it is our duty as citizens, not as bourgeois, as citizens, to send the police after these guys, to get the little ones under control and to get the big ones under control. So, and that would be is the state function. So we have to learn, to think of how this imbalance can be overcome.